There's a moment in every workplace where someone gets sized up in 3 seconds flat. You know the look. The one that says, "You don't belong here." Bernard Okafor got that look every single morning he walked through the service entrance of the Meridian Grand Hotel in downtown Toronto, and every single morning he smiled, clocked in, and said nothing. That's the part people never understood about Bernard. Before I tell you what happened on the morning of March 14th, the morning that changed everything at the Meridian Grand, I want you to think about the last time someone underestimated you. Really underestimated you. Not just doubted you. I mean, looked right through you like you were furniture. Because that's what they did to Bernard Okafor. For 2 years, they looked right through him. And then one Tuesday morning, he made every single one of them wish they hadn't. Bernard Okafor was 41 years old, Nigerian-Canadian, with close-cropped gray-salted hair and the kind of quiet that people mistake for emptiness. He wore the same thing every shift: gray coveralls, steel-toed boots, a laminated staff ID clipped to his chest pocket. He pushed a maintenance cart through the Meridian Grand service corridors every morning at 6 a.m., checked boiler pressure, tested fire suppression systems, replaced burnt bulbs in hallways that guests never saw. He was, by every measure the hotel's management team used to measure people, invisible. He had been at the Meridian Grand for 26 months. In that time, he had filed 4 maintenance reports that prevented what would have been costly equipment failures. He had once stayed 4 hours past the end of his shift to help reroute emergency plumbing during a pipe burst on the 14th floor. He had never called in sick. He had never been late. He had, twice, found guests' lost property in the corridors, a passport once, and a laptop bag, and returned both to the front desk without being asked. None of that was in the file that Sandra Tillett kept on Bernard Okafor. Sandra Tillett was 53, white, aggressively credentialed, and had been the Meridian Grand's general manager for 6 years. She had a way of walking through the hotel that reminded the junior staff of a principal doing rounds. Head slightly tilted, lips slightly pursed, eyes moving in a continuous sweep of judgment. She wore tailored blazers and her hair in a chignon, and she spoke to the maintenance team the way a person speaks to a dishwasher. Not rudely, exactly, just without the assumption that it understood. Sandra had never learned Bernard's name. Not in 26 months. She called him the maintenance guy in meetings and you to his face, and if she'd been pressed on it, she would have said she simply hadn't had occasion to interact with him directly. Which was not entirely a lie. But it wasn't the truth either. The truth was that Sandra Tillett divided the Meridian Grand staff into 2 categories: the people who mattered for the hotel's image and the people who kept the hotel running. She was very good at managing the first category. She had almost no awareness that the second category existed. The call came in on a Wednesday, not a Tuesday. I got that wrong a moment ago, and I want to be honest with you. I'm telling you this story the way it was told to me, and I want to get it right. Wednesday, March 15th, 6:47 in the morning. Sandra Tillett was in her office on the 3rd floor reviewing occupancy projections when her assistant, a young man named Tyler, who had been with her 8 months and had learned not to knock before entering, knocked before entering. "Miss Tillett, we have a situation." The situation was this: Vincent Kwok was arriving. If you follow Canadian commercial real estate, and I don't, and you probably don't either, but stay with me, you would know the name Vincent Kwok the way people in medicine know certain surgeons. Not necessarily by face, but by weight. Vincent Kwok was 64 years old, Hong Kong-born, Vancouver-based, and was the principal behind Kwok Capital Group, which had quietly accumulated a portfolio of hospitality properties across Western Canada worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $340 million. He had been in discussions with the Meridian Grand's parent company, a mid-sized hospitality group called Harland Collective, for the better part of 8 months. The deal on the table was a management contract for 3 Harland properties in British Columbia, worth, conservatively, $18 million in fees over a 5-year term. Vincent Kwok did not do deals over email. He did deals in person, in private, after he had assessed the people he was dealing with. He had apparently decided that the assessment would happen this week. He had sent a message, through his assistant, in Mandarin, the previous evening, saying he would arrive at the Meridian Grand at 9 a.m. and expected a meeting room, a specific tea service, and a particular room temperature. The message had been received by Harland Collective's communications team at 10:30 p.m. and forwarded to Sandra Tillett at 11. She had read it at 11:45, realized she could not read Mandarin, forwarded it to her assistant Tyler at midnight with the message translation needed urgently, and Tyler, 24 years old, a hospitality management graduate from Ryerson, had run it through a translation app and sent back a rough summary at 1 a.m. The summary was incomplete. The translation app had flagged 3 phrases it couldn't render confidently. Tyler had noted this. Sandra had not read the note. So by 6:47 on Wednesday morning, Sandra Tillett knew that Vincent Kwok was coming, that he wanted a meeting room, and that he had preferences regarding tea and temperature. She did not know the specifics of those preferences, because the 3 untranslated phrases were the specifics. She had, in the 7 hours between Tyler's message and this moment, not arranged for a Mandarin interpreter. This had not occurred to her. It had occurred to Tyler, who had flagged it in a second message at 1:15 a.m., and Sandra had seen that message and thought, "I'll sort it in the morning." It was morning. "Get me someone who speaks Mandarin," she said to Tyler. "I've called the agency we use for interpretation services," Tyler said. "Earliest availability is 11 a.m. Vincent Kwok was arriving at 9. Call another agency. I've called 3. It's 7 a.m. Sandra stood up. She walked to her window. Below on King Street, the city was doing what it did. Delivery trucks, early commuters, a man walking a dog the size of a small horse. She pressed one finger to the glass and thought very hard. "What about staff?" she said. "Does anyone here speak Mandarin?" Tyler had prepared for this question. "I checked the HR files. Front desk, no. Concierge, no. Food and beverage, Chef Renata has some Cantonese. She says maybe 30% overlap. She's not confident. Events coordinator, no." He paused. "I didn't check the facilities and maintenance team." Sandra made a sound that was not quite a dismissal, but was close to one. "The maintenance team. I can check." She waved her hand in a way that meant, "Yes, but don't expect anything." Bernard Okafor was in the mechanical room on sub-level 2, running a diagnostic on the HVAC system for the East Wing when Tyler found him. Tyler was slightly out of breath because the service elevator had been occupied and he'd taken the stairs. "Sorry to interrupt," Tyler said, and he meant it, which Bernard noticed. "I'm Tyler, Miss Tillett's assistant. Quick question. Do you, by any chance, speak Mandarin?" Bernard looked up from the panel. He had a small flashlight in one hand and a wiring schematic in the other. "Why?" he said. It was not a defensive question. It was a genuine one. Bernard Okafor had long ago learned to ask why before yes, because in his experience, the people who asked favors of maintenance workers rarely thought through what they were actually asking. Tyler explained. Quickly, accurately, without condescension. Bernard listened. When Tyler finished, Bernard set the flashlight down on the top of the cart. He looked at the HVAC panel for a moment. Then he said, "I need 20 minutes to finish this diagnostic. If I leave it mid-run, I have to start over. We have about 90 minutes before he arrives." "Then I'll have time," Bernard said. "Tell Miss Tillett I'll be upstairs at 8:30. Tyler blinked. He had expected either a yes or a no. He had not expected a schedule. "Should I? Do you want me to confirm that with her?" "That's up to you," Bernard said and turned back to the panel. Sandra Tillett's reaction when Tyler relayed this was not gratitude. It was skepticism with a thin overlay of desperation. "The maintenance guy speaks Mandarin." "He didn't confirm that directly," Tyler said carefully. "But he didn't deny it. Why would a maintenance worker speak Mandarin?" Tyler, who was 24 and had grown up in Scarborough and had a more complicated relationship with that question than Sandra did, said, "I'm not sure that's the relevant question right now, Ms. Tillett." Sandra looked at him. It was not a warm look. But she said nothing because she was, fundamentally, a practical woman and she had 90 minutes and no alternatives. At 8:22, Bernard Okafor stepped off the service elevator on the third floor. He had washed his hands, he had his coveralls on. He had not changed because he hadn't been asked to change and because, though no one knew this yet, it didn't matter to him either way. He knocked on Sandra Tillett's office door and waited. Sandra opened it. She looked at him the way you look at a lottery ticket before you scratch it, half hopeful, half braced for disappointment. "You speak Mandarin," she said. It came out as a statement, not a question, because she'd decided the question was beneath her at this point. "I do," Bernard said. "How well?" There was a pause. Not a hesitant one, a considered one. "Mr. Kwok is from Hong Kong," Bernard said. "He'll likely use Cantonese in casual conversation, but default to Mandarin in business settings. It's a formality thing. His message used simplified characters, which suggests his written Chinese is mainland-influenced, probably from business dealings. I can work in both registers." His tea preference, in the original message, was for Taiwanese high mountain oolong, served at 80 degrees, not boiling. The translation app your team used rendered that as specialty tea warm. The room temperature he specified was 21 degrees Celsius, and he asked specifically that the chairs around the meeting table not be the swivel type because he finds them distracting. Sandra Tillett stared at him. "How do you know what the original message said?" "Tyler forwarded it to me when he came downstairs," Bernard said. "I asked him to." Another pause. Longer this time. "Why didn't you say any of this when Tyler spoke to you?" Bernard looked at her calmly. "You didn't ask." "I need to stop here for a second and tell you something about Bernard Okafor, because what I just told you might make him sound like he was being difficult. He wasn't. He was being precise. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one. Bernard Okafor had come to Canada from Lagos in 2003 when he was 22 years old, with an engineering degree from the University of Lagos and a letter of admission to the master's program in mechanical engineering at the University of Toronto. He had completed that degree. He had then spent 11 years at an infrastructure consulting firm, working on building systems, HVAC, structural, electrical, for commercial and hospitality properties across Ontario and Quebec. He had also, during those years, traveled extensively for work, 3 years of quarterly trips to clients in mainland China and Taiwan, working on joint venture projects. He had hired a tutor in the first year. He had kept studying after the projects ended, because he found languages interesting and because he had a memory that retained things cleanly once he'd learned them. In 2019, his firm had downsized. Bernard had been among the 31 people let go. He had spent 8 months consulting independently, picked up some contract work, and then, when cash flow got tight and a friend mentioned the Meridian Grand was hiring in maintenance, he had applied. He was overqualified by a significant margin. He did not mention this in his application because he needed the job and he knew what happened to overqualified applicants. He had been at the Meridian Grand for 26 months. In that time, no one had asked him what he'd done before. The Kwok Capital Group arrived at 9:03. Vincent Kwok was 64 and compact, with silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had been the most important person in every room for so long that he'd stopped tracking it. He was accompanied by 2 associates, a younger man who handled documents and an older woman who said very little and appeared to be assessing everything. They were met in the lobby by Sandra Tillett, who had changed into her sharpest blazer and was operating at a level of professional warmth that her regular staff had never seen directed at them. The introductions were managed. The meeting room, now equipped with the correct tea, correctly heated, with non-swivel chairs. The temperature precisely 21 degrees was ready. Sandra had personally overseen the last-minute adjustments, moving with an urgency that had baffled her front desk staff, who had rarely seen her move urgently about anything. Bernard Okafor stood to one side of the doorway to the meeting room. He was still in his coveralls, Sandra had, in the 90 seconds between the lobby and the meeting room, leaned toward him and said, under her breath, "Is there something else you can wear?" Bernard had said, also under his breath, "No." That was the end of that conversation. Vincent Kwok noticed Bernard immediately. Not because Bernard did anything. Because Vincent Kwok was 64 years old and had spent 4 decades reading rooms, and the man in the gray coveralls standing with the stillness of someone who was comfortable waiting. That man was interesting. The meeting began. Sandra opened, in English, with a prepared overview of Harland Collective's portfolio performance and the terms under discussion. The younger associate translated, in a slightly stilted English to Mandarin, render that Vincent listened to with patient courtesy. Then Vincent Kwok set down his tea, looked at Sandra, and said something in Mandarin. Sandra's smile held. Her eyes moved to Bernard. Bernard stepped forward. He spoke. His Mandarin was unhurried and clear, with the kind of ease that doesn't come from apps or classes alone. It comes from years of professional use, from the specific vocabulary of construction timelines and hospitality management and boardroom negotiation. He listened to Vincent's question, translated it cleanly for Sandra. Mr. Kwok wants to know whether the management model Harland is proposing involves any restructuring of the existing local operations teams at the 3BC properties, or if those teams would remain intact. It was a specific question, an important one, the kind you ask when you want to know whether someone has done their homework or is winging it. Sandra had done her homework on this, she answered. Bernard translated, and then something shifted. Vincent Kwok looked at Bernard directly for the first time and spoke to him, not through him. He asked, in Mandarin, what his role was at the hotel. Bernard answered in Mandarin. He said, "Facilities maintenance." Vincent's expression did not change, but his associate, the older woman, made a very small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or might have been something else entirely. Vincent asked another question, still in Mandarin, still directed at Bernard. Bernard answered. Sandra, who could not follow any of this, said carefully, "Could you translate?" Bernard looked at her. He asked whether I'm the most technically experienced person on the facilities team. I told him yes. He then asked whether I had an engineering background. I told him I had a master's in mechanical engineering from the University of Toronto and 11 years in infrastructure consulting before joining the hotel. A pause. He then said, and I'm translating closely here, that he finds it notable that a hotel would place someone with that background in a maintenance role without making fuller use of their expertise, and that this suggests something about how the organization values its people. The room was quiet. Sandra Tillett looked at Bernard Okafor as if she were seeing him for the first time, which, in every meaningful sense, she was. Vincent Kwok said something else. Bernard translated without expression. He says he likes the tea. The meeting ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. It ended with a handshake and a verbal commitment from Vincent Kwok to move to the next stage of due diligence, which his associate noted in a small leather notebook. As the Kwok Capital Group prepared to leave, Vincent stopped in the hallway outside the meeting room, turned to Bernard, and spoke in Mandarin one final time. Bernard nodded. Sandra watched this exchange with the focused attention of someone who has just realized they do not understand the language being spoken in their own house. When Vincent Kwok was gone, she turned to Bernard. What did he say? Bernard considered for a moment. He said that if Harland Collective doesn't know what they have in their maintenance department, he'd be happy to tell them. Sandra said nothing for a long time. The hallway was quiet. Down the corridor, Tyler appeared with a tablet, saw the look on Sandra's face, and silently retreated. Why didn't you say anything? Sandra said finally. About your background, your qualifications. In 2 years, why didn't you say anything? Bernard looked at her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with something more neutral and more considered than either. Would it have changed anything? He said. Sandra opened her mouth, closed it. Bernard nodded once, the way you nod at an answer that doesn't need saying out loud, and walked back toward the service elevator. I'm going to be direct with you now, because that's the kind of channel this is. What Bernard Okafor did that morning wasn't a revenge story. I know that's what we want it to be. We want the music to swell when he walks into that boardroom in his coveralls and saves the deal. We want Sandra Tillett to get some kind of formal reckoning. We want the ending tied up clean. And I get that. I want that too sometimes. But here's what actually happened in the weeks after March 15th. Harland Collective's CEO got a follow-up call from Vincent Kwok's office. In that call, Kwok's team mentioned, specifically by name Bernard Okafor, and noted that Harland appeared to have an underutilized asset in their Toronto property. The CEO of Harland Collective was a man who paid attention to what Vincent Kwok's office said, because that was the kind of man he was. He called Sandra Tillett. That conversation, I'm told, was not comfortable. Bernard was asked to come in for a meeting, not in the maintenance office, but upstairs in the third-floor boardroom. He arrived in his coveralls again, not because he was making a point, but because it was his shift and he'd come straight from a boiler check. He was offered a role as Facilities and Infrastructure Director for Harland Collective's Ontario properties, a position that, in terms of title, salary, and scope, was more accurately aligned with his actual qualifications. He asked for 48 hours to think about it. He took the job. Sandra Tillett was, 6 weeks later, moved laterally into a regional oversight role that came with the same title and a narrower portfolio. It was handled quietly, the way these things usually are. No announcement, no explanation. Her ID still opened the same doors. The scope of what those doors led to was simply smaller than it used to be. Whether that was connected to the events of March 15th, no one officially said. Bernard, for his part, never mentioned it. Here's what I keep coming back to, and I think about this more than I probably should. Bernard Okafor had been in that building for over 2 years, every morning. Through the service entrance, up to the mechanical room, down the corridors that guests never saw. He knew the building better than anyone in it. He knew which pipes ran cold in winter and which elevator shaft had a torque problem that had been documented and ignored since 2022. He knew the names of every person on the cleaning crew, the kitchen porters, the overnight security team. He brought coffee sometimes. He stayed late when it mattered. And for 26 months, no one upstairs thought to ask him a single question about who he was. There's a version of this story where that feels like a tragedy. And I think it is. A little. I think about the 18 months before Bernard. Someone who had done this, who had the experience and the credentials. I think about the problems that went unfixed, the decisions made without his input, the knowledge just sitting there in the maintenance corridors, 2 floors below everyone who could have used it. But there's another version of this story too. The one where Bernard Okafor walked into a room in gray coveralls, said 6 words of Mandarin, and quietly, permanently changed every assumption in the building. That version is also true. Both things can be true at once. I've found that's usually how it works. If this story made you think of someone you know who gets looked past, whose qualifications sit quietly under a uniform or a job title that doesn't fit, leave their name in the comments. You don't have to say much. Just a name. I'll read everyone. And if you've been that person, if you've ever been Bernard, I think you know what I'm about to say. Keep showing up. Do the work they're not watching. Because the day someone finally asks the right question in the right room, you want your answer to be ready. That's all we do here at Hollow Stories. We find the people who didn't get the headline, and we make sure they get the story. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this if someone needs to hear it. I'll see you next time.